The Treaty of Versailles was a huge turning point for the world wars. Signed on June 28, 1919, it was a contributing factor for World War II to take place. The treaty made harsh accusations against Germany, which was not a good example of rights and responsibilities of humans in conflict.
Signed in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles formally ended World War I. Seen as a mediocre compromise, it was problematic from the very beginning, creating an unstable order in Europe. Many considered it destined to falling short of ensuring a lasting peace. At the time, Mike Nyberg reminds us, observers read the treaty through competing lenses. A desire for peace after 5 years of disastrous war, demands for vengeance against Germany, the uncertain future of colonialism, and most alarmingly, the emerging threat of Bolshevism.
Particularly what the Germans argued, that it was one-sided. That, for example, following the terms of the treaty, there are a lot of plebiscites, referenda in disputed border territories. But these are held in places where they're likely to go against Germany. They're not held in places where the people might vote to stay with Germany.
The Big Four are the four main leaders of the Allied powers who played a leading role in creating the Treaty of Versailles after World War I.
Four, which included David Lloyd George from Great Britain, Georges Clemenceau from France, of course Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, and the Prime Minister of Italy, Vittorio Orlando.
The treaty established the League of Nations, whose responsibility was to promote cooperation and peace after World War I. The League was quite successful for some time, but was later proved to be unsuccessful.
The main thing that's important globally is the setting up of the League of Nations. Remember, the League of Nations Covenant is the first 26 articles of the Treaty of Versailles. So the League of Nations is absolutely built into that treaty. And the League of Nations is meant to have a global impact, not just within Europe. For a time, in the 1920s, you can argue that the League of Nations is quite successful. It helps to deal with a number of disputes, for example, in South America or in the Balkans between Greece and Turkey. There are a number of crises where the League of Nations successfully mediates. But once you get into the 1930s, then the whole sort of global balance shifts in favour of what becomes the axis of Rome, Rome-Berlin axis, or Japan, Germany, and Italy. And in the 1930s, the League of Nations is not supported by the Western powers, who go into isolationism in the case of the US, or appeasement in the case of Britain and France, and the sort of collective security structure falls apart. But the League of Nations is there, but the League of Nations is much resented by many countries around the world.
The treaty weakened European countries both military and economy-wise. The reparations Germany had to pay put a burden on its economy.
There was loss of land, reparations, and those were the main factors. Germany went bankrupt at one point in the 20s, and arguably it led the way to disenchantment and a renunciation of the treaty by Hitler.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles includes a provision that Germany must compensate the victor countries for the damage that had been caused to them during the war. As they argue, this is Article 231, by the way, Article 231 of the Versailles Treaty. This is the so-called War Guilt Clause, which says that World War I had been caused by German aggression. And therefore, it is right that Germany should compensate financially for the damage that's been done. The Germans always resisted that. There's a big crisis over it in 1923, when the French and Belgians occupy the Ruhr coalfield in Western Germany to try to force Germany to pay reparations. The Germans retaliate with a strike, and workers go on strike. Weimar government funds them. That puts such pressure on the German government that causes hyperinflation. This is when the German mark becomes worthless. In 1923-24, the Great Inflation.
Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for causing the war. This clause, often referred to as the War Guilt Clause, was a deeply controversial aspect of the treaty. This was not a good example of rights and responsibilities because it blamed Germany and its allies for the destruction and loss of life caused by World War I.
And the disarmament clauses, these are much harsher on Germany than they are on the Western powers. If you look at the Treaty of Versailles, it provides that Germany should be disarmed, reduced to an army of 100,000 men, which is very small, no air force allowed, very small navy, no tanks, no poison gas, no military aircraft. And this is all imposed on Germany forever. All that the British and French and Americans agree to do is to discuss disarmament, but they're not under any obligation to do any reduction in their armed forces at all. So it's a kind of one-sided disarmament arrangement which goes particularly against Germany. Though the Treaty of Versailles looks very idealistic. It says this is to stop a new arms race happening. Actually, the disarmament clauses of the treaty are meant to keep Germany weak and disarmed. So the grounds for saying it's punitive, these are all controversial, I think, but the strongest grounds for saying it's unfair.
The Treaty of Versailles is considered to have a major role in the outbreak of World War II. The accusations that the treaty harshly put on Germany were unfair and unjust, partly leading to the rise of Hitler.
You can argue that it's one-sided if you look at the territorial arrangements or the security arrangements. And the Germans, of course, are kept out of the League of Nations. They're not allowed to join it for several years after the peace treaty as well. That's another one. So there are many areas in which the Germans feel that they have been treated one-sidedly. Of course, the Allied response to that, or people who were defending the treaty, would say that the Germans had started the war, they had committed aggression, and therefore it was not unreasonable that they should be treated more severely than the people who had been the victims of the aggression. There's a more difficult question, which is, did the Treaty of Versailles cause the rise of the Nazis and Hitler coming to power? And I think the answer to that is partly. Most of the German leaders and the Nazi leaders, including Hitler himself, of course, were World War I veterans. Hitler writes about this in his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. But the same is true of Goering, for example, who becomes his number two and becomes put in charge of the Air Force, the Luftwaffe. Rudolf Hess, another of the leading Nazis, says the Third Reich comes from the trenches. They all been very much influenced by what had happened in World War I, and particularly by the way in which it had ended.
Overall, Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for causing the war, ordered to pay reparations, and lost large amounts of land. The treaty ended up making harsh accusations against Germany, which was not a good example of rights and responsibilities of humans in conflict. The Big Four and other important leaders had a duty in restoring peace to the world, and ended up failing to restore peace and instead cause an outbreak.